Marcus Carter was a man who had earned his place at the top. A major investor in one of the world's leading airlines, he had wealth, power, and influence. But none of that mattered when he walked into the Orion Airways VIP lounge, because to them, he didn't look like he belonged. Denied entry, dismissed, treated like a problem instead of a respected figure in the very company he helped build. But what started as an act of discrimination quickly escalated into something much bigger. The CEO arrived. The board got involved. And by the time it was over, Orion Airways would never be the same again. This wasn't just about one man, it was about a system that needed to change. And Marcus? He was about to make sure it did. Where in the world are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments. And if you love stories that challenge the way we see the world, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. Marcus Carter stepped into the gleaming airport terminal, rolling his designer carry-on behind him. His sharp navy blue suit and polished leather shoes screamed success, but he knew from experience that success wasn't always enough. He had just wrapped up a major business deal in Dubai and was eager to relax before his flight back to New York. As a high-tier investor in Orion Airways, Marcus had unlimited access to all its VIP lounges worldwide. Yet he braced himself, knowing that power and privilege didn't always shield him from prejudice. Approaching the entrance of the Orion Sky Lounge, he presented his black membership card. The receptionist, a young woman with crisp blonde hair and a name tag that read Chloe, barely glanced at it before offering a tight smile. "I'm sorry, sir, but this lounge is for first class and elite members only." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "I know. That's why I'm here." Chloe exhaled impatiently, her eyes flicking to the next guest in line, a white businessman who looked far less put together than Marcus. She immediately brightened and gestured for him to step forward. "Welcome, Mr. Dawson. Right this way." Marcus remained where he stood. "Excuse me," he said calmly. "I believe I was here first." Chloe's expression hardened. "Sir, I think you're mistaken. We don't allow," she hesitated, as if realizing she was about to say something that would get her in trouble. Instead, she exhaled sharply. "This is a private lounge." Marcus chuckled under his breath. "Private for who?" She didn't answer. A few curious passengers nearby had begun to notice the exchange. The tension thickened. "I'd like to speak to a manager," Marcus said, maintaining his composure. "I don't think that's necessary," Chloe replied. "Security will be here shortly to assist you." Marcus tilted his head. "Security? For what exactly?" Before she could answer, two uniformed guards arrived, their expressions unreadable. "Is there a problem here?" one of them asked. Chloe folded her arms. "This gentleman is refusing to leave." One of the guards turned to Marcus, his stance subtly firm. "Sir, we need to ask you to step aside." A slow smile spread across Marcus's face. "You know what? Let's make this interesting." He pulled out his phone and dialed number. As it rang, he looked Chloe in the eye. "Are you sure you don't want to reconsider?" She scoffed. "I don't take orders from guests." The call connected. "This is Marcus Carter. Tell CEO Richard Langston that he needs to get down to the lounge immediately." Chloe's smirk faltered. The guards exchanged glances. Marcus slipped his phone back into his pocket and crossed his arms. "Now let's see how this plays out." Silence hung thick in the air. Chloe's smirk had vanished, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. The security guards, once standing firm, shifted slightly, exchanging unsure glances. The name Marcus Carter clearly meant something, but not enough for them to act yet. Marcus remained where he was, calm and composed. He had seen this before, the slow unraveling of confidence, when people realized they had underestimated him. He wasn't angry. No, anger would give them what they wanted. Instead, he would let time do the work. Chloe forced a laugh, but it came out nervous. "Sir, I don't know who you think you're calling, but our CEO is very busy." "I highly doubt he's going to." She stopped mid-sentence when her earpiece crackled to life. A faint voice came through, just loud enough for Marcus to hear. "Chloe, what the hell is going on? Is there a problem with the guest?" Chloe pressed a finger to her earpiece, turning away slightly. "No problem at all, Mr. Reynolds," she said quickly. Just handling a minor misunderstanding. Marcus smiled. Reynolds, the lounge manager. That meant the call had already reached the top. The security guards remained in position, unsure whether to remove him or let things play out. Nearby passengers were pretending not to watch, but stealing glances, sensing that something bigger was unfolding. Marcus tapped his watch. I'd say you have about 3 minutes before this misunderstanding turns into a company-wide embarrassment. Chloe's lips pressed into a thin line. She was calculating, trying to decide if she could still get away with this. Then, the elevator dinged. All eyes turned. A tall man in a gray suit stepped out, his ID badge clipped neatly to his chest. Gerald Reynolds, lounge manager. He walked briskly, his eyes scanning the situation before landing on Marcus. His face paled. "Mr. Carter," Reynolds said, forcing a tight smile. "What seems to be the issue here?" Before Marcus could respond, Chloe jumped in. "Mr. Reynolds, I was just explaining to this gentleman that the lounge is for VIP members only." And Reynolds held up a hand. "And Mr. Carter is a VIP." Chloe blinked. "I didn't realize." Reynolds' eyes flickered with frustration. "You didn't check? I mean, he just walked up and I assumed." "You assumed," Reynolds repeated, his voice sharp. "You assumed that Marcus Carter, one of our largest investors, wasn't allowed in his own lounge." The color drained from Chloe's face. She glanced at Marcus, then back at Reynolds, searching for a way out. But before she could finish, another voice cut through the air. "What's going on here?" A second elevator had arrived, and out stepped a man whose presence commanded attention. A man in a tailored navy suit, silver hair slicked back, with an air of authority that turned heads. "Richard Langston, CEO of Orion Airways." Chloe gasped. Even Reynolds stiffened. Langston walked toward the small gathering, his piercing blue eyes assessing the situation in seconds. He didn't look at Chloe, Reynolds, or the guards. He looked directly at Marcus. And then, to everyone's shock, he smiled. "Marcus," Langston said, reaching out to shake his hand. "Good to see you." The entire lounge fell into a stunned silence. Marcus shook his hand firmly, smiling back. "Likewise, Richard." Langston turned to Reynolds. "Why was I called down here?" Reynolds cleared his throat, shooting a look at Chloe. "It seems there was a mix-up." "A mix-up." Langston's voice was calm, but sharp. "I'd like to hear it from Mr. Carter himself." Marcus finally turned his gaze to Chloe, whose eyes were wide with panic. He could see her putting the pieces together, realizing that the man she had dismissed, insulted, and called security on wasn't just any passenger. He had the power to change her career with a single word. Marcus let the silence stretch for just a second longer before speaking. "Well," he said, voice smooth. "Let's just say I wasn't exactly given a warm welcome." Langston's eyes darkened. Chloe visibly swallowed. And in that moment, she knew her fate was no longer in her hands. A thick tension hung in the air as Marcus's words settled. The entire lounge seemed to be holding its breath. Richard Langston, CEO of Orion Airways, kept his gaze locked on him, his expression unreadable. Chloe, now visibly shaken, stood frozen behind the reception desk. Marcus could feel the weight of the moment. He had been here before, looked down on, underestimated, dismissed. But this time, he wasn't just another passenger. This time, he had the power to expose a flaw in the very system that claimed to represent excellence. Langston turned to Chloe. "What happened?" His voice was calm, controlled, but there was an edge to it that made everyone uneasy. Chloe swallowed hard. I thought he wasn't a member," she stammered. "I didn't recognize him." Langston's eyes narrowed. "Did you check his credentials?" Chloe opened her mouth, then closed it. There was no excuse. Reynolds, the lounge manager, cleared his throat. "Sir, I believe this was just a misunderstanding. A regrettable one," but Langston cut him off with a sharp glance. "A misunderstanding?" He let out a dry laugh. "A misunderstanding that involved calling security on one of our biggest investors." Reynolds shifted uncomfortably. Chloe, now visibly pale, looked around for an escape, but found none. Marcus folded his arms. I'd love to believe it was just a mistake, he said smoothly. But tell me, Chloe, how many other passengers did you misunderstand today? Chloe's lips parted, but no words came out. Langston sighed, rubbing his temple. Marcus, he said, his voice softer, I apologize on behalf of Orion Airways. This is unacceptable. Marcus nodded, but remained silent. He wanted to see where this was going. Langston turned back to Chloe. You do realize that Mr. Carter is not just a VIP member? He's a major investor in this airline. Without people like him, this lounge, this company doesn't exist. Chloe looked down, her breathing uneven. Langston exhaled sharply, then looked at Reynolds. We have policies against this kind of treatment, do we not? Reynolds nodded quickly. Yes, sir. We do. Langston's gaze returned to Chloe. Then tell me, what should happen now? Chloe flinched. She shook her head. I made a mistake. A mistake, Langston echoed, his voice measured. A mistake that cost this company its reputation, at least for today. Marcus watched as Chloe's shoulders hunched forward. He could see the fear in her eyes. This was the moment where she would face the consequences of her bias. And yet, he knew something else too. Firing her wouldn't change the system. It would only remove one person while the problem remained beneath the surface. Langston turned back to Marcus. It's your call. Chloe's head snapped up. She looked at Marcus in disbelief. Wait, you're letting him decide? Langston's expression didn't change. That's right. Marcus let the silence stretch. He saw the desperation in Chloe's eyes, the way she clutched her hands together as if trying to stop them from shaking. Then, finally, he spoke. I don't want her fired. Everyone, including Chloe, blinked in shock. Langston raised an eyebrow. No. No, Marcus repeated. Because firing one person won't fix anything. A flicker of relief crossed Chloe's face, but Marcus wasn't done. What I do want, he continued, is change. Real change. Every employee in this lounge should go through proper training. They need to know what real customer service looks like. More importantly, they need to understand what bias looks like. Langston considered this. You want company-wide reform? Marcus nodded. If this happened to me, it's happened to others. I want accountability. And I want to know that the next black traveler or any person of color who walks through these doors won't have to prove they belong. Langston let out a breath, then nodded. Done. Reynolds looked surprised. Sir, that would mean, I said done, Langston repeated, his tone final. Starting today, all Orion Airways employees will undergo mandatory bias and service training. No exceptions. Chloe's relief was short-lived. She would keep her job, but she would have to face her actions, day after day, knowing she had almost lost everything because of her assumptions. Marcus turned back to her. I hope you learned something from this, he said evenly. Chloe nodded, unable to meet his eyes. I will. Langston gestured toward the lounge entrance. Shall we? This time, Marcus walked through the doors without resistance. As he stepped inside, he heard whispers ripple through the crowd. People had seen everything. The story was already spreading. And Marcus Carter? He had just changed the game. The Orion Sky Lounge was designed to impress. Polished marble floors reflected the soft glow of modern chandeliers, while plush leather seats invited weary travelers to sink into luxury. A well-stocked bar offered premium drinks, and the aroma of gourmet meals drifted through the air. Marcus had been in countless lounges like this before, but this time it felt different. This time, he wasn't just another traveler. He was a man who had forced a corporation to confront its own blind spots. As he settled into a corner seat, Richard Langston sat across from him, unbuttoning his suit jacket. A waiter immediately approached, offering drinks. Langston glanced at Marcus. The usual? Marcus smirked. So you do remember. Langston chuckled, turning to the waiter. Macallan, 18-year neat. The waiter nodded and disappeared. Langston leaned forward. You handled that well. Marcus shrugged. Handled what? Langston gave him a knowing look. You could have torn that woman apart. You had every right to. Instead, you chose reform over revenge. Not many people would. Marcus exhaled slowly. Firing her wouldn't have changed the culture. It would have just made an example of one person while the system remained broken. He took a pause, then met Langston's gaze. But don't get me wrong, I don't let things slide. I expect you to keep your word. Langston nodded. And I will. Their drinks arrived, and both men took a moment to settle in. So, Marcus said, swirling the amber liquid in his glass, tell me the truth. If I wasn't Marcus Carter, if I was just another black businessman without connections, how do you think that would have ended? Langston's jaw tightened slightly. He didn't answer immediately. That's what I thought, Marcus said. Langston sighed. Look, I won't insult you by pretending this was a one-time issue. It's not. And that's exactly why I agreed to your terms. If we don't fix it now, it's only a matter of time before something worse happens. And next time, the cameras will be rolling. Marcus appreciated the honesty. He'd dealt with CEOs who dodged accountability, hiding behind rehearsed corporate statements. Langston, at least, was willing to face reality. Good, Marcus said. Because if I don't see change in the next quarter, I'll reconsider my investment. Langston let out a sharp laugh. You don't hold back, do you? I don't have the luxury. Langston nodded, understanding the deeper meaning behind those words. As they sipped their drinks, a hushed conversation nearby caught their attention. A few tables over, a well-dressed white man whispered something to his colleague while eyeing Marcus. The second man smirked and shook his head. Marcus didn't need to hear them to know exactly what they were saying. He had seen that look 1,000 times. What's he doing here? Must be an athlete or a rapper. No way he actually belongs in this lounge. Langston noticed too. You want me to handle that? He asked quietly. Marcus smiled, taking another sip of his whiskey. No need. He leaned back in his chair, casually stretching out his legs, making sure they could see the expensive watch on his wrist, the confidence in his posture. He didn't need to prove anything to them, but he enjoyed watching them squirm. And just as he expected, the moment their eyes met, the two men quickly looked away, suddenly engrossed in their drinks. Langston smirked. You're enjoying this, aren't you? Marcus chuckled. Let's just say I've learned how to navigate these spaces. Langston swirled his drink, studying him for a moment. You ever think about taking a bigger role at Orion? Marcus raised an eyebrow. You trying to recruit me? Langston shrugged. You already have a stake in the company. You clearly care about how it runs. And after what just happened out there, well, let's just say we could use someone like you steering the ship from the inside. Marcus considered the offer for a moment, then smirked. I don't work for anyone, Richard. Langston laughed. I figured you'd say that. He lifted his glass. But if you ever change your mind, the door's open. They clinked glasses. And just like that, Marcus Carter had done what few men in his position had ever been able to do. He hadn't just walked into a space where he was unwelcome. He had taken a seat at the table. Marcus set his glass down and leaned back in his seat, watching the lounge operate around him. The air buzzed with quiet conversations, the occasional clink of glasses, and the soft hum of a distant jazz tune. Everything seemed normal on the surface. But beneath the luxury, he could feel the tension subtle, but present. Langston had made an interesting offer. A role at Orion Airways? It wasn't the first time someone had tried to pull him into the corporate world. But Marcus had always built his own path. He wasn't about to become a token hire, a diversity figurehead to patch up their PR issues. Still, the situation today had exposed something deeper than one biased receptionist. This wasn't just about Chloe. This was about a system that allowed people like her to operate without consequence until someone like Marcus forced accountability. He turned back to Langston. You serious about that offer? Langston raised an eyebrow. Would I have said it if I wasn't? Marcus exhaled. If you want real change at Orion, hiring one black executive won't fix the problem. You know that, right? Langston nodded slowly. I do. You can roll out diversity training, adjust policies, fire a few bad apples. But unless the leadership understands a problem at its core, you'll be right back here in 6 months when another incident blows up. Langston studied him. So what do you suggest? Marcus drummed his fingers on the table. He wasn't the kind of man who pointed out problems without offering solutions. Start at the top, Marcus said. Your boardroom, your leadership team. How many people of color are sitting at that table? Langston sighed, running a hand over his jaw. Not enough. Then that's your problem, Marcus said bluntly. Bias isn't just about rude receptionists. It's about the people who set the rules. If they don't understand the issue, how can they fix it? Langston leaned forward, his elbows on the table. You know, the reason I started talking to you about a bigger role? It's not just because of what happened today. I've been looking at the numbers. Marcus's eyes narrowed slightly. What numbers? Langston took out his phone and pulled up a document, sliding it across the table. Passenger demographics. Revenue breakdown. The percentage of black travelers flying Orion has grown by 27% over the past 5 years. But our retention rate? Our customer satisfaction among that demographic? Way lower than it should be. Marcus glanced at the screen. He wasn't surprised. Because they don't feel welcome. Exactly. Langston tapped the table. So yeah, I need to fix this. Not just for PR. Not just because it's the right thing to do. But because if we don't, we'll start losing customers, and that's bad business. Marcus smirked. Now that sounds like a CEO talking. Langston chuckled. I'm a businessman, Marcus. Always have been. But I also know that businesses survive by adapting. Marcus appreciated the honesty. Langston wasn't pretending to be some social justice warrior. He was protecting his bottom line. Fine. Marcus could work with that. He tapped the phone screen. So here's what you do. You bring in consultants, real ones, not the PR-friendly ones who tell you what you want to hear. You audit your hiring process. You look at how promotions happen, who gets overlooked, and why. And you make real changes, not just statements. Langston nodded slowly. And if I do all that, will you stay on as an investor? Marcus took a sip of his drink, considering. I'll stay, he said finally. But I'll be watching. Langston laughed, shaking his head. Something tells me I wouldn't expect anything less. Their conversation was interrupted when a woman in a dark blue suit approached their table. She looked hesitant, as if she wasn't sure whether she should interrupt. Excuse me, she said, directing her gaze at Marcus. Mr. Carter? Marcus turned to her. Yes. She shifted on her feet. I just wanted to say I saw what happened earlier, and I wanted to thank you. Marcus raised an eyebrow. Thank me? She nodded. I work for Orion, not in the lounges, but corporate. And well, I've been here long enough to see how things are. People don't say it out loud, but we feel it. What happened to you today? That's not rare. But the way you handled it? That's rare. Marcus studied her for a moment. She was young, probably in her early 30s, with a look in her eyes that he recognized ambition, but also frustration. What's your name? He asked. Naomi Bennett, she said. I work in policy development. Langston frowned. Bennett? I don't think we've met. Naomi smiled tightly. I'm not exactly in the rooms where big decisions happen. Marcus glanced at Langston, then back. At Naomi. Maybe that's the first thing that needs to change. Naomi hesitated, then nodded. I hope so. She looked at Marcus once more. Anyway, I just wanted to say that. Thank you. As she walked away, Marcus turned back to Langston. Tell me again about that leadership problem, he said. Langston smirked. Something tells me you already have a solution. Marcus just smiled. Because this was only the beginning. Marcus watched as Naomi disappeared into the sea of polished shoes and expensive suits, her words lingering in the air. I'm not exactly in the rooms where big decisions happen. That sentence alone told him everything he needed to know. He turned back to Langston, who was still swirling the last sip of whiskey in his glass, deep in thought. You've got smart people in this company, Marcus said. People like Naomi. So why aren't they being heard? Langston sighed, rubbing his temple. I won't lie to you, Marcus. The airline industry? It's still run by the same kind of people it was 50 years ago. Mostly white. Mostly men. Mostly resistant to change. Marcus smirked. And yet, You're here talking to me. Langston chuckled. I'd like to think I'm a little more adaptable than most. He set his glass down and exhaled. But the truth is, even if I want to change things, there are people on the board who don't. Marcus leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. Then you need to start shaking the tree. Because if you don't eventually, the whole damn thing is going to rot from the inside. Langston looked at him, studying his face. What are you suggesting? Marcus tapped his fingers on the table. You need to do more than roll out training programs and PR campaigns. You need structural change. That means rethinking how you hire, promote, and most importantly, who's making the decisions at the top. Langston smirked. And let me guess, you already have an idea on how to do that. Marcus leaned back. It starts with people like Naomi. You've got employees who see the problem but have no power to fix it. You need to create pathways for them to move up. Give them a voice. And while you're at it, he gestured to Langston's phone. Audit your board. Langston raised an eyebrow. You want me to tell a bunch of powerful executives that they're part of the problem? Marcus shrugged. If you don't, someone else will. Langston exhaled, staring into his empty glass. He wasn't an idiot. He knew Marcus was right. He had seen the numbers, had heard the complaints. But confronting the board? That was another battle entirely. I'll tell you what, Langston said, finally looking back at him. Come with me to the next shareholder meeting. Marcus raised an eyebrow. And? Do what? Langston smirked. Say exactly what you just said to me. In front of them. Marcus chuckled. You think they'll listen? Langston's smirk grew. Oh, they'll have to. Because if they don't, I'm going to make sure every investor in that room knows that our airline is failing to keep up with the world. Marcus studied him for a moment. He had to admit he liked Langston's style. The man knew how to play the long game. All right, Marcus said. I'll be there. Langston extended a hand. Then it's a deal. Marcus shook it, but before he could say another word, his phone buzzed. He glanced down. It was an email from one of his assistants. The subject line caught his attention immediately. Orion Airways discrimination incident. Gaining traction, he tapped it open and scanned the contents. Social media may not have been involved when the incident happened, but people had noticed. Someone must have overheard or seen what went down because blogs and travel forums were already picking up the story. Marcus let out a slow breath. Well, looks like you've got a PR storm heading your way. Langston frowned. What? Marcus slid his phone across the table. Langston read the email, and his expression darkened. Damn it, he muttered. Marcus smirked. You didn't think something like this would stay quiet, did you? Langston pinched the bridge of his nose. Of course not. I just hoped we'd have more time to handle it internally. Marcus leaned back. Then you better act fast. Because if you don't control the story, someone else will. Langston exhaled sharply, then stood up. I need to get ahead of this. We'll talk soon. Marcus nodded, watching as Langston walked off, phone already in hand, barking orders to his PR team. As Marcus sat back in his chair, he couldn't help but chuckle to himself. The storm had only just begun. Marcus remained in his seat, sipping the last of his whiskey as he watched Langston disappear into the crowd, already working to contain the situation. He knew how these corporate PR storms played out. There would be rushed meetings, carefully worded statements, and desperate attempts to minimize the damage. But Marcus also knew something else. This wasn't just about Orion Airways anymore. It was about something bigger, a conversation that corporations avoided until they were forced into it. He glanced at his phone again. The email had included links to multiple travel forums where discussions were heating up. I just saw something crazy at the Orion Lounge in JFK. Black investor denied entry, while white passengers walked right in. Anyone else had similar experiences? Not surprised. Flew Orion last year, got treated like a second-class citizen despite having platinum status. This is why I stick with other airlines. These companies only care when their bottom line is threatened. If enough people speak out, they'll have to do something. Marcus smirked. The pressure was already building. A soft voice interrupted his thoughts. Excuse me, Mr. Carter. He looked up. Naomi Bennett stood there again, a hint of hesitation in her posture. Marcus gestured to the seat across from him. Naomi, right? Have a seat. She hesitated before sitting down. I saw Langston leave in a hurry, she said. I assume you told him what's happening? Marcus nodded. Social media's picking up the story. Your CEO is about to have a very long night. Naomi exhaled. I'm not surprised. I've seen situations like this get buried before, but something tells me this one won't be ignored. Marcus tilted his head. And why is that? She gave him a small smile. Because you're in it. Most of the time, incidents like this happen to people without power. But you have a platform. Influence. They can't just sweep it under the rug. Marcus studied her for a moment. You've been paying attention. Naomi shrugged. I have to. I work in policy, remember? My job is to track company responses to situations like this. But normally, my reports don't change anything. Marcus leaned forward. Then maybe it's time they do. Naomi hesitated. How? Marcus tapped the table. You've seen the flaws in the system. You know where the problems are buried. I have the leverage to make them listen. So tell me, Naomi, if you had the power to change things at Orion, what would you do? She blinked, as if she hadn't expected the question. Then, after a moment, she straightened in her seat. I'd start with hiring, she said firmly. People like Chloe aren't the real issue, they're a symptom. If we had leadership that actually valued diversity, these incidents wouldn't keep happening. Marcus nodded. Go on. I'd also change how promotions work, she continued. Right now it's an old boys club. The same people move up, while the rest of us stay invisible. Marcus smirked. You mean people like you? She exhaled. Yeah, people like me. Marcus liked her honesty. He could tell she wasn't angling for anything, she just wanted change. And that was valuable. His phone buzzed again. Another email. This time from a journalist. Marcus, I'm hearing rumors about an incident at Orion Airways. Any comment? He chuckled. The media was circling. Naomi noticed. Reporters. Yep. He locked his phone and looked back at her. So here's the question. Naomi, when Orion Airways releases its statement, do you think it'll actually mean something? Or will it just be another PR stunt? Naomi hesitated. Then she shook her head. They'll do what companies always do, damage control. Apologies without action. Marcus exhaled. Then let's make sure that doesn't happen. Naomi frowned. How? Marcus smiled. By making it clear that empty words won't be enough this time. Naomi stared at him for a moment, then nodded slowly. The game was changing, and Marcus Carter was about to make sure it would never be played the same way again. The next morning, Marcus sat in the private lounge of his hotel, coffee in one hand, phone in the other. The Orion Airways website had just been updated with an official statement. He already knew what it would say before even reading it. He skimmed the text, shaking his head. Orion Airways is committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion. We take these matters seriously and are conducting a full internal review. We sincerely apologize to any passenger who may have felt unwelcome and will take the necessary steps to ensure that all customers are treated with the respect they deserve. Marcus exhaled slowly. Predictable. Safe. Empty. He set his phone down just as another notification popped up. It was a text from Langston. Richard Langston, I assume you've read it. Call me when you're free. Marcus debated ignoring it for a moment, but he knew Langston would keep pushing. He took a slow sip of coffee, then dialed. Langston picked up on the second ring. Before you say anything, I know what you're thinking. Marcus smirked. Then I don't have to say it. Langston sighed. Look, the legal team wouldn't let me go harder. They were worried about liability. Marcus scoffed. Liability? You mean the liability of telling the truth? Langston hesitated. The board wanted something neutral. Marcus shook his head. Neutral doesn't fix anything. Neutral is just a way of saying we don't want to offend the wrong people. Langston was silent for a moment. All right, then tell me, what should we have said? Marcus leaned forward, elbows on the table. You should have called it what it was. Discrimination. You should have addressed the systemic bias, not just the unwelcome feelings of passengers. And most importantly, you should have given the public a concrete action plan, not just a vague internal review that no one believes in. Langston let out a low chuckle. You really don't hold back, do you? Nope. Langston exhaled. All right. What if I told you we're working on something bigger? A real strategy to address these issues long term. Marcus raised an eyebrow. Go on. I took what you said to heart. About the leadership, the hiring, the culture shift. I want to do it right, but I also need time. Marcus leaned back. Time is a luxury. The public isn't patient. Langston's voice was calm, but firm. Then I'll give them something real to hold on to. We're making immediate changes to how complaints are handled. No more brushed-aside reports. Every single incident will be logged and reviewed by a dedicated oversight team. And as for hiring, I want people like Naomi at the table. That caught Marcus's attention. You're promoting her? She doesn't know yet, Langston admitted. But yes, I want her in a leadership role where she can actually influence policy. And I want you involved too. Marcus chuckled. Still trying to recruit me? Langston laughed. You're the one who said companies don't change from the outside. Marcus took a thoughtful pause. The truth was he didn't need this. He had built his own empire, thrived on his own terms. But there was something about this moment, about the opportunity to force real change in a space that had resisted it for so long. And if he didn't step in, who would? He finally sighed. I'll think about it. Langston seemed satisfied. That's all I ask. As Marcus ended the call, his phone buzzed again. Another journalist. Another request for comment. The world was still watching. And now so was he. Marcus sat in his hotel suite, staring out at the Manhattan skyline. The morning sun glinted off the glass towers, a reminder that the world kept moving, whether companies like Orion adapted or not. His phone was buzzing nonstop. Journalists wanted his take on Orion's vague statement. Investors were reaching out, wondering if this controversy would hurt the airline stock. Even a few high-profile executives from other airlines had sent quiet messages of support, each one careful not to be too public, as if acknowledging the problem could be seen as taking sides. And then there was Langston's offer. Marcus Carter, part of Orion Airways leadership? The idea was almost amusing. He had spent his life fighting to create his own lane, refusing to be boxed into anyone else's system. Now, the same system that had tried to dismiss him was asking for his help. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. He checked the peephole and smirked. Naomi Bennett. Marcus opened the door. You do realize this is a 5-star hotel, right? You don't have to knock like you're delivering room service. Naomi smirked back. I wasn't sure you'd let me in. Marcus stepped aside. Come in. She walked in, setting down her bag before turning to face him. I assume you know why I'm here, she said. Marcus folded his arms. Langston told you. Naomi nodded. He offered me the promotion this morning. Wants me to lead internal policy reform. And Naomi hesitated. And I don't know if I should take it. Marcus raised an eyebrow. Why not? She let out a sharp breath. Because what if it's just optics? What if they put me in that role just to make the company look better without actually changing anything? Marcus understood that fear all too well. Corporate America loved to elevate people of color when they were in damage control mode. It made for a good headline, but real influence? That was harder to come by. You worried they'll use you? Marcus asked. Naomi nodded. Marcus studied her for a moment, then walked over to the minibar and grabbed 2 bottles of water. He tossed one to her. You have 2 choices, he said. You can turn it down and walk away, knowing nothing will change. Or you can take the job and make it impossible for them to ignore you. Naomi opened the bottle, but didn't drink. And what if I fail? Marcus smirked. Then you'll be exactly where you are now. But at least you'll have tried. She took a deep breath, then nodded slowly. And what about you? Are you taking Langston's offer? Marcus chuckled. Still thinking about it. Naomi tilted her head. Let me guess. You don't like the idea of answering to a corporation. Marcus took a sip of water. I don't like the idea of playing by someone else's rules. Naomi crossed her arms, then changed the rules. Marcus looked at her, surprised. She stepped closer. Look, you don't need this, Marcus. But they do. You're not some random diversity hire. You have leverage. If you take this, you won't just have a seat at the table, you'll be able to flip the whole damn table over if you want to. Marcus let her words sink in. She wasn't wrong. Langston hadn't offered him a role out of charity. He had done it because he knew Marcus had power, not just financial, but influence. He had a voice that people listened to. And if he stepped into this, he wouldn't be walking in as an employee. He'd be walking in as the man who forced Orion Airways to change. Marcus exhaled. You're good at this. Naomi smirked. I know. Marcus glanced at his phone. Another message from Langston. This time, he didn't ignore it. He picked it up, dialed, and when Langston answered, he didn't waste time. I'm in. 2 weeks later, Marcus Carter walked into the Orion Airways corporate headquarters in Midtown Manhattan. He had been in plenty of boardrooms before, but this one was different. This wasn't just a business deal or an investment meeting. This was the moment where he would decide whether this company truly wanted change, or if they were just hoping he'd be their shield until the controversy died down. Naomi walked beside him, dressed in a navy suit, her confidence sharp as ever. She had accepted her new role, and Marcus could already tell she was ready to shake things up. You sure about this? She asked as they stepped into the elevator. Marcus smirked. Not even a little. She laughed. Good. That means you're about to do something real. The elevator doors opened to Orion's executive floor. Langston was waiting outside the conference room, arms crossed. When he saw Marcus, he extended a hand. Glad you're here, he said. Marcus shook his hand. Let's see if I still feel that way in an hour. Langston chuckled, but didn't argue. He pushed open the glass doors, leading Marcus and Naomi into a long conference room where a group of executives and board members were seated. The air was thick with tension. Some of these people had likely fought against Marcus being here. He could see it in the tightness of their smiles, the way some of them barely acknowledged him. Good. He wasn't here to make them comfortable. Langston gestured for Marcus to take a seat. Let's get started. An older man at the far end of the table cleared his throat. Before we move forward, I'd like to make something clear, he said, adjusting his silver-rimmed glasses. While we appreciate Mr. Carter's input, we need to ensure that our approach remains balanced. We don't want to overcorrect and create unnecessary disruptions. Marcus smirked. Here we go. Naomi leaned in. You mean you don't want to lose control? The man bristled. That's not what I said. Marcus leaned back in his chair, casually adjusting his cufflinks. Let me make something clear, he said. You didn't invite me here because you wanted to. You did it because you had to. A few executives shifted in their seats. Langston remained quiet, letting Marcus take the floor. I don't do symbolic positions, Marcus continued. I'm not here to make Orion look progressive for a press release. If that's what you want, I'll walk out right now. No one spoke. Or, Marcus said, you can listen. You can stop worrying about overcorrection and start worrying about why your company nearly lost investors, customers, and public trust in a matter of days. A woman near the middle of the table finally spoke. And what exactly do you propose, Mr. Carter? Marcus exchanged a glance with Naomi before turning back to the room. For starters, transparency. No vaguer statements. You address discrimination head-on, and you show exactly how you're fixing it. The woman nodded. And beyond PR? Marcus smiled. Now, they were getting to the real work. You overhaul your hiring and promotion system. No more informal networks that keep the same people in power. You create pathways for diverse leadership. He gestured to Naomi. People like her shouldn't have to fight to get a seat at the table. Naomi straightened, her expression unreadable. But Marcus could tell she appreciated that. One of the older board members scoffed. That sounds like forced diversity. Marcus's smirk didn't waver. No, that sounds like fairness. Silence. Langston finally leaned forward. I agree with Marcus. That caught their attention. He continued, "We're not doing this just to save face. We're doing this because it's necessary. If we want Orion to thrive, we can't afford to keep running things the way we have." The resistance in the room was still there, but Marcus could see the shift. Some of them were realizing that this wasn't just a PR stunt anymore. This was happening. And Marcus? He was in the pilot seat now. Langston turned to him. "You willing to stay on and see this through?" Marcus met his gaze. Then he looked at Naomi. She nodded subtly. He turned back to the board. "I don't just want to see it through," Marcus said. "I want to make sure it sticks." A few of the more reluctant board members exchanged uneasy glances. They knew what that meant. Marcus Carter wasn't just here to advise. He was here to change the rules entirely. 1 month later, Orion Airways released a second statement this time, one with real weight. They publicly acknowledged past failures and outlined a clear action plan. A complete audit of hiring practices, a leadership mentorship program, and mandatory bias training across all departments. Naomi was officially appointed as Director of Policy Reform. Marcus was named as a senior advisor to the board. And Chloe? She kept her job, but was now required to go through a full year of training, mentorship, and performance reviews. She had a chance to learn, but the message was clear: this wasn't a free pass. The reaction was immediate. Investors responded positively. Customers appreciated the accountability. And most importantly, employees, especially those who had felt invisible, finally saw the possibility of real change. As Marcus boarded his flight back to New York, he settled into his first-class seat, stretching out comfortably. A flight attendant approached with a glass of champagne. "Mr. Carter, welcome aboard. Can I get you anything else?" Marcus smiled. "No, I'm good. Just taking in the view." And for the first time in a long time, it actually felt like progress. Change doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't come from one statement, one meeting, or one policy. It comes from people demanding better, refusing to accept the way things are, and pushing for what they should be. Marcus Carter didn't just fight for himself. He fought to make sure the next person walking into that lounge wouldn't have to fight at all. And that's the real lesson. So now let's hear from you. Have you ever experienced or witnessed a situation like this? What do you think companies need to do to create real change? Let's talk about it in the comments. And before you go, where in the world are you watching from? Drop your country or city below. If you enjoyed the story and want more content like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a new video. See you in the next one.